The solicitor's office smelled of old paper and older money. Harriet Voss sat in the waiting room with her coat still buttoned, her hands folded in her lap, her expression giving away nothing. Around her, the other people who had been summoned to Whitmore and Graves on a gray Tuesday morning in November were doing exactly what people do when they are waiting for money. They were performing grief while calculating figures. Her cousin Gerald was there. He had driven up from Surrey in a new car that still had the dealership stickers on the rear window, and he was wearing a black tie that looked like it had been purchased that morning specifically for this occasion. He sat with his legs spread wide and his phone face up on his knee, and every few minutes he refreshed something on the screen with his thumb, though what he was refreshing Harriet could not say. Her Aunt Philippa was there too, in the chair nearest the window, wearing the expression of a woman who had already decided what she deserved and was waiting for the world to confirm it. Philippa had always been that way, arranging reality in advance, then becoming personally offended when it failed to match her arrangement. She had a tissue in her hand that she was not using. It was a prop, Harriet understood. Everything about Philippa was a prop. And then there was Harriet. She had taken the train from Edinburgh. She had not told anyone she was coming. She had received the same letter the others had received, thick cream envelope, solicitor's letterhead, the words "You are named in the estate of Mr. Edmund Voss," deceased printed in the kind of font that wanted you to understand it had been chosen carefully. She had read the letter once, folded it back into the envelope, and placed it in the inside pocket of her coat, where it had stayed for 4 days before she finally booked the train. She had not cried when Edmund died. She was aware that this made her appear cold. She was also aware that the people in this room, Gerald, Philippa, the 2 second cousins she barely remembered whose names were either Charlotte and Miles or Miles and Charlotte, had cried very publicly and very immediately, posting photographs on social media of themselves at the funeral with captions about loss and legacy that had accumulated hundreds of sympathetic responses from people who had never met Edmund Voss and were not going to inherit anything from him. Harriet had attended the funeral. She had stood at the back. She had not posted anything. She was 34 years old. She had the kind of face that people described as difficult to read, which was something she had worked at, though she would never have admitted that. She had brown hair pulled back simply, no jewelry except small gold studs in her ears, and she was wearing the same coat she had owned for 6 years. A charcoal wool thing that was neither fashionable nor unfashionable, simply well-made and warm. She had bought it with her first proper salary check, and she had never felt the need to replace it. Edmund Voss had been her father's brother. Her father had died when Harriet was 11, which meant that Edmund was the last Voss of his generation, the last person alive who had known her father as a young man, who had known the family before it became what it had become, which was to say complicated and litigious and prone to gathering in solicitors' offices. She had visited Edmund 3 times in the last year of his life. The others had visited more. She knew this because Philippa had mentioned it pointedly at the funeral, within earshot of the solicitor's assistant who had been hovering near the sandwiches. Some of us were there for him, Philippa had said, to no one in particular and very much to Harriet. Some of us made the effort. Harriet had said nothing. She had taken a sandwich and moved away. The door to the inner office opened, and a young man in a well-pressed suit appeared and said that Mr. Whitmore would see them now. Everyone stood with a speed that was slightly embarrassing, like students when a teacher enters the room, and they filed through into a large wood-paneled room where a man of about 60 was seated behind a desk the size of a dining table. Mr. Whitmore had the face of someone who had delivered bad news so many times that it had become, for him, a form of professional satisfaction. He gestured at the chairs arranged in a semicircle before his desk and waited until everyone was seated before he opened the folder in front of him. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I'll dispense with the preamble. Edmund Voss made his final will and testament in September of this year, 6 weeks before his death. He was of sound mind. I can confirm this personally, as I was present at the signing, and the document is entirely unambiguous." Gerald leaned forward slightly. Philippa adjusted her tissue. "The estate of Edmund Voss," Mr. Whitmore continued, "consists of the following: the property at Cartwell House, Derbyshire, including all land and outbuildings currently attached to the title. The investment portfolio, held with Voss Meridian, valued at the time of this reading at approximately £4.3 million. The private collection of objects, documents, and artworks housed at Cartwell House. and the controlling share, 51% of Voss Meridian Industries, a privately held company registered in England and Wales. The room was very quiet. Voss Meridian Industries. Harriet knew the name, of course. Everyone in this room knew the name. It was Edmund's company, had been his company for 30 years, a mid-sized industrial engineering firm that had contracts with several major infrastructure projects across the UK and Europe. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of company that appeared in lifestyle magazines. But it was profitable, and it was substantial, and the 51% controlling share was, by any measure, the most significant asset in the room. The property at Cartwell House, Mr. Whitmore said, along with the investment portfolio and the private collection, is to be divided equally among the following beneficiaries. And he read out a list that included Gerald, Philippa, the cousins, and several charitable organizations that Edmund had supported. There were murmurs of acknowledgement. Gerald's shoulders visibly relaxed. The 51% controlling share of Voss Meridian Industries, Mr. Whitmore said, and paused just long enough for everyone to lean forward, is bequeathed in its entirety to Miss Harriet Voss. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. Harriet did not move. Gerald turned to look at her. The expression on his face passed through several stages in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, recalibration, and then something that settled into a thin and careful blankness that was doing a great deal of work to conceal what was underneath. Philippa did not turn. She stared at Mr. Whitmore with the expression of a woman who has been told that the weather is wrong. "There must be an error," Philippa said. "There is no error," Mr. Whitmore said pleasantly. "Harriet has never worked in industry. She has no background in—" "The bequest is unconditional," Mr. Whitmore said. "Mr. Voss left no stipulations regarding the beneficiary's professional qualifications." "What does she know about running a company?" This was Gerald, who had recovered enough to speak, though his voice had the strained quality of a man who is trying to sound reasonable while being very unreasonable. "She's an archivist. She works in a library." Harriet looked at the desk. "I work at the National Records of Scotland," she said quietly. "It isn't a library." "The point stands," Gerald said. "The point stands for you to take up with whoever you choose," Mr. Whitmore said. "The will is clear. Miss Voss, I would ask you to remain after the others have departed, so that we can discuss the practical matters of the transfer." The room did not empty gracefully. Philippa stood and said something under her breath that Harriet did not catch, but understood perfectly. Gerald paused near the door and looked back at Harriet with an expression that was trying to be sympathetic and achieving something closer to predatory. "Look," Gerald said, "this doesn't have to be difficult. Edmund was clearly not, in the last months he wasn't entirely." "Gerald," Harriet said. "Yes. Please go." He went. Mr. Whitmore waited until the sound of their footsteps had faded before he poured 2 cups of tea from a pot that had clearly been prepared in advance, and set one in front of Harriet. "They'll contest it," he said. "I should tell you that immediately. Gerald has already retained a solicitor. He engaged 3 days after Edmund died before this reading, which tells you something about his confidence in the original will's contents." "What do I need to do?" Harriet said. "Nothing immediately. The will is sound. I drafted it myself. Edmund was insistent on several points, which I'll come to." He opened the folder again. "You should know that Voss Meridian is not in a simple position at the moment. Edmund had been dealing with some challenges. In the last 18 months, there have been significant questions raised about several of the company's infrastructure contracts. There's a government review underway. The board is divided. And there is a managing director, a man named Clifford Ashe, who Edmund appointed 3 years ago, who has been effectively running the company since Edmund's health declined." "What kind of challenges?" Harriet said. Mr. Whitmore considered the question. "That," he said, "is perhaps something you should discover for yourself. Edmund wanted you to go to the company. He was very specific about that. He said," and here he consulted a note in the folder, something handwritten that Harriet could see was in an old man's careful cursive. "He said that you would understand what you found there, that you were the only one who would." Harriet looked at the note without reaching for it. "Did he say why?" "He said you had been paying attention when no one else was." Mr. Whitmore looked at her steadily. "I asked him what that meant. He smiled and said I would find out." Harriet picked up her tea and drank it. Outside the window, London was doing what London did in November, proceeding in gray and purposeful indifference. The city generating its own weather, its own logic, its own sense of what mattered and what did not. She had been paying attention. Yes, she had. She did not go to Voss Meridian immediately. She went back to Edinburgh first, back to her flat above the cobbled street in Leith, her bookshelves, her careful filing system, her 2 rooms of organized silence. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a notebook, and she wrote down everything she knew, which was more than anyone in that solicitor's office had imagined. The notebook had been going for 3 years. It had begun not as anything intentional, not as a plan, but as the kind of thing that happens when a person with a very good memory for documents starts noticing that certain documents don't align with other documents. She had visited Edmund the first time 18 months ago, not because she was dutiful or because she expected anything from him, but because he had called her and asked her to come, and he had sounded different, older than his age, careful in a way he hadn't been before. She had gone to Cartwell House and they had sat in his study, which smelled of wood smoke and old leather, and the particular mustiness of documents that have not been moved in a long time. Edmund had poured them both a whiskey even though it was 2 in the afternoon, and he had said without preamble, "I think someone is stealing from me, Harriet, and I think I've been too foolish and too trusting to see it until now." She had asked him what he meant. He had shown her papers. She was an archivist. Gerald had said it dismissively, as if it were a small thing, a quiet thing, the occupation of a person who organized other people's stories while having none of their own. But archiving was not a small thing. Archiving was the science of understanding how documents related to other documents, how the absence of a record was itself a record, how the pattern of what was saved and what was destroyed told you more about the truth than any single piece of paper could. She had looked at Edmund's papers for 3 hours. Then she had come back 2 weeks later with her own files. Then again 6 months after that. And in between those visits, she had been working quietly, making calls, sending carefully worded requests for information to regulatory bodies and Companies House and the National Archives, reading the public-facing documents of Voss Meridian Industries against the private documents Edmund had shared with her and finding gaps, discrepancies. The negative space where something should have been and wasn't. She opened her notebook now and read through her notes with the same methodical attention she would have given to any archive project. No emotion, no hurry, just the discipline of understanding what was there and what it meant. Clifford Ashe had joined Voss Meridian 3 years ago as managing director. His background was in finance, specifically, in the kind of restructuring consultancy that moved through struggling companies, identified assets, and then, if you were watching carefully, arranged for those assets to migrate in directions that were not always obvious from the outside. On paper, Voss Meridian under Ashe's management had performed adequately. Revenues were stable. The major contracts had continued. But if you really looked, at the subsidiary structure of the company, at the network of smaller firms that Voss Meridian contracted work to, at the consultancy agreements and the licensing arrangements, and the particular way certain intellectual property had been valued and transferred, you started to see something that was not in any annual report. You started to see that the company Edmund Voss had built over 30 years was being very slowly, very carefully hollowed out. Harriet closed the notebook. She thought about Clifford Ashe, whom she had never met, who had been running the company since Edmund's health declined, who would now find himself answering to a woman he had never heard of who worked in an archive in Edinburgh. She thought about what he would assume about her. She thought about how useful those assumptions were going to be. She called Mr. Whitmore on Wednesday morning and told him she would visit Voss Meridian on the following Monday. "Should I inform them you're coming?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Tell them I'm coming to observe. Tell them I have no immediate plans to make any changes." A pause. "Is that true?" "No," Harriet said, "but it's what I'd like them to think." Another pause. She could hear Mr. Whitmore recalibrating, the slight shift in his breathing that meant he was revising his understanding of who he was dealing with. "Very well," he said. "I'll have my assistant contact the board." "Thank you. And Mr. Whitmore, is there any chance Edmund kept a private correspondence file? Letters, notes, anything handwritten?" He kept everything, Mr. Whitmore said. I believe it's all at Cartwell House. Good, Harriet said. I'll need access to that before Monday. Cartwell House was a large, slightly unhappy-looking property in a fold of the Derbyshire Hills, the kind of house that had been impressive once and was still substantial, but had lost the habit of warmth. Edmund had lived there alone for the last 12 years, since his wife had died and his children had moved away. The children, 2 of them, both adults, both living abroad, had sent their condolences from a distance, and were, according to Mr. Whitmore, unlikely to contest the will, having already received substantial gifts from Edmund while he was alive. She arrived on Friday afternoon, and the housekeeper, a woman called Mrs. Renton who had been with Edmund for 20 years, and whose red eyes suggested a grief that was entirely unperformed, met her at the door and led her through the house to the study. He said you'd come, Mrs. Renton told her, which was not what Harriet had expected to hear. Said to give you the key to the cabinet. She handed Harriet a small brass key. The cabinet was a tall wooden thing against the far wall, locked, which Harriet had noticed on her previous visits, but which Edmund had never opened in front of her. She unlocked it now and found inside exactly what she had hoped, not what she had been afraid of finding, which was that someone had already been through it. 40 years of Edmund Voss's private correspondence, arranged by year, each bundle tied with the kind of faded red ribbon that was once standard in legal and clerical offices across Britain. Below the correspondence, in a separate section, were folders. Not the manila folders of a filing cabinet, but proper archival folders, acid-free, the kind that someone had either bought intentionally or had acquired from a professional source. Someone had prepared this cabinet carefully. Someone had wanted this material to be found, in good condition, by someone who knew what to do with it. She sat on the floor of Edmund's study. She had moved a reading chair to the side because she preferred, when working with documents, to have them spread around her at the same level, and she began. She worked through Friday evening and most of Saturday, breaking only to eat the sandwiches Mrs. Renton brought without being asked, and to sleep for 5 hours on the reading room sofa. By Saturday afternoon, she had read through the correspondence chronologically and had moved to the folders. The folders were where Edmund had kept the things he'd gathered after he first became suspicious. Bills of sale, copies of contracts, annotated pages from board minutes, Edmund's handwriting in the margins, small and precise, asking questions that the minutes themselves did not answer. Valuations of company assets by 2 different firms that had arrived at numbers so different as to be incompatible. A letter from a regulatory solicitor, not Whitmore, that Edmund had apparently consulted privately, marked confidential and containing 2 paragraphs that Harriet read 3 times. And at the back of the last folder, folded into a plain envelope with her name written on the outside in Edmund's handwriting, a letter. She opened it. Harriet, if you are reading this, then the will has been read, and you now own the controlling share of something I am not proud of, not because of what it was, but because of what I allowed it to become. I am not going to explain everything in this letter. I don't think I understand everything myself. But I know that something is wrong, and I know that I have not been able to prove it alone, and I know that you are the only person in this family who would know how to look. Your father used to say that you were born with a talent for seeing what was missing. He meant it as a compliment. I hope you will take it as one. In the folders in this cabinet, you will find everything I have gathered. Some of it will make sense immediately. Some of it will only make sense when you see what is actually happening inside the company. I am trusting you to put the pieces together because I was not able to, and because the people who are doing this are counting on no one being able to. I am sorry that I am leaving you this instead of something simpler. With love and faith in you. Edmund. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and sat for a moment in the quiet of the study. Then she took out her notebook and began writing. She arrived at Voss Meridian Industries headquarters on Monday morning at 9:05, not exactly on time, which she had judged correctly would be interpreted as slight disorganization rather than deliberate latency. The headquarters were in a business park outside Sheffield, a large modern building of glass and steel that Edmund had commissioned 15 years ago, and that still bore his name in brushed aluminum letters above the entrance. The reception desk was manned by a young woman who greeted her with professional neutrality and called someone on the phone, and within 3 minutes, a man appeared who introduced himself as Marcus Webb, head of communications, and who had the smooth, managed energy of a person whose job was to control what other people saw. "Miss Voss," he said, extending his hand, "welcome, we're so glad you've been able to come." His tone implied the opposite. "Thank you," Harriet said. "Mr. Ashe is looking forward to meeting you. He's asked if you'd like to start with a tour, or—" "I'd like to see the operations floor first," Harriet said, "before anything else." A fraction of a pause. "Of course. Right this way." The operations floor was where the actual work of Voss Meridian happened. The engineering project management, the contract administration, the technical teams. It was a large, open-plan space of perhaps 100 people, and it had the feeling of a place that had been tidied very recently, not organically tidy, but performatively so, the way a house looks when someone has been told guests are coming. She walked slowly. She looked at the work on the screens she could see, not obtrusively, not leaning in, but in the peripheral way she had learned over years of archive work, the way you could take in a document's character without reading every word. She looked at the organization of the desks. She looked at the faces of the people who looked at her, some curious, some deliberately incurious. One young man near the window who met her eyes briefly, and then looked quickly back at his screen in a way that she noted without showing she had noted it. Marcus Webb narrated. He was good at it. He explained what teams did what projects were currently live, what the company's pipeline looked like for the next 3 years. He used the word robust several times. He used the phrase under Edmund's vision in a way that made it clear he was performing grief while filing Edmund Voss into the past tense as efficiently as possible. Then Clifford Ashe appeared. She had found photographs of him online. He was the kind of man who appeared at industry events and in trade publications, confident, well-dressed, the sort of face that photographed well because it was constructed primarily of surface. In person, he was taller than she'd expected, with silver hair and the particular kind of tan that is acquired in places that cost a great deal to visit. He was perhaps 55. He wore his authority the way expensive clothes are worn, not thinking about it, assuming it. He looked at Harriet, and she could see in the fraction of a second before his professional expression assembled itself the actual assessment taking place. The coat, the face, the age, the job she'd been described as having. And she could see the conclusion he reached, which was the conclusion she had been expecting him to reach, which was manageable. "Miss Voss," he said with warm authority, "welcome, I'm Clifford Ashe." "Mr. Ashe," she said, "I want to say how deeply sorry I am about Edmund. He was extraordinary. We all felt his absence very keenly." "I'm sure," Harriet said. "I hope that today gives you a good sense of how the company works. I know this is all new to you, and I want to make absolutely certain you feel supported. The board is very much looking forward to meeting you. We have a session scheduled for Thursday." "I saw the invitation," Harriet said. "I'll be there." "Wonderful," he smiled. The smile was practiced and complete, the kind that reached the eyes because the person had learned that eyes needed to be included. "In the meantime, please treat this as your home. Ask anything you like. Marcus will look after you." He said Marcus will look after you in the way that one says it, when what one means is Marcus will manage you. "Thank you," Harriet said. "There is one thing I'd like if it's possible." "Of course. I'd like access to the document management system. Read-only is fine for now. I'd like to get a sense of the company's record-keeping practices." The pause this time was measurable, half a second. The smile remained, but something behind it shifted. "Our document systems are quite technical," Ashe said. "I'm not sure how useful they'd be without." "I work in document management," Harriet said pleasantly. "I'll be fine." Another pause. Shorter this time because he was recalculating and didn't want her to see how long the calculation took. "Of course," he said. "Marcus, can you arrange that?" "Absolutely," Marcus Webb said. They gave her a desk in a small meeting room off the main corridor, a deliberate choice, she understood, as the meeting room had glass walls and could be observed from the corridor, which meant she could be watched. She said nothing about this. She sat down, opened her laptop, and waited for the IT access to be granted. It took longer than it should have. 1 hour and 20 minutes, during which time she drank the coffee that had been brought to her, read through the public annual reports of Voss Meridian for the last 5 years on her own laptop, and made 17 additional notes in her notebook. When the access was granted, she began. She worked with the methodical efficiency of someone who had spent 12 years understanding how organizational documents were structured, what was filed where, what the filing structure itself revealed about institutional priorities, where the gaps appeared, and what the gaps meant. She was not looking for any single smoking gun. She was reading the archive the way you read any archive, as a whole, as a body of evidence that told a story not in its individual items, but in their relationships to each other. By Wednesday evening, she had confirmed everything she had suspected from Edmund's private files, and found 3 things she hadn't known. The first was that a series of consulting contracts, substantial ones, totaling nearly £12 million over 2 years, had been issued to a company called Merville Advisory Partners. Merville's publicly available information was thin. It was registered in Scotland, had been incorporated 18 months ago, had no website, and its listed director was a man named Thomas Birch, whom she had not previously encountered. The second was that 2 of Voss Meridian's most valuable intellectual property assets, engineering processes that Edmund had developed in the 1990s, and that were the technical foundation of several major contracts, had been quietly revalued downward in the last 18 months, a revaluation that had reduced their worth on the company's books by approximately 60%. The third was a set of minutes from a board subcommittee meeting, dated 8 months ago, that referenced a decision taken to proceed with a particular course of action regarding what was described only as the Principal Asset Restructuring Program. No further detail appeared in the minutes. The meeting had not been attended by Edmund, who had at that point been too unwell to travel, and the absence of any reference to informing him of the subcommittee's work struck her as significant. She sat in the glass meeting room with these 3 things and a cup of cold tea, and looked out at the corridor where people were packing up for the evening, and she understood something about what Clifford Ashe had done, and something about what he intended to do next, and something about how much time she had before the shape of what she understood became visible to him. Not much time, she thought, but enough. The board meeting on Thursday was held in a large, corporate-neutral room on the 4th floor that had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the car park, and a long table of the kind designed to make whoever was at its head look authoritative. Clifford Ashe sat at its head. Harriet was shown to a chair at the far end, a choice that was either accidental or intentional, and she had stopped assuming things were accidental. There were 9 board members. She had researched all of them in the previous 2 evenings. 3 were independent non-executives with substantial profiles in industry. 2 were Voss Meridian's own senior executives, the CFO, a man named Barry Good, and the COO, a woman named Sandra Price. 2 were representatives of minority shareholders, institutional investors. 1 was a solicitor representing the estate's interests during the transition, and 1 was Clifford Ashe, who was also managing director. They looked at her with the variety of expressions that a group of powerful people produces when confronted with someone they have collectively decided is not powerful. Clifford Ashe opened the meeting with a brief statement welcoming her and reiterating his condolences. The other board members murmured appropriately. Then he moved to the agenda, which was dense with items: quarterly performance, contract updates, personnel matters, and near the end, an item titled Ownership Transition and Strategic Review. She listened. She listened the way she had been trained to listen to primary sources, not for what was being said, but for what the structure of what was being said revealed. Who deferred to whom? Who looked at Ashe when questions were raised? Who chose their words carefully and who chose them carelessly, and what the difference between those 2 choices indicated about what each person knew and what they feared. Barry Good, the CFO, looked at Ashe before answering almost every question, a microsecond delay that Harriet noted each time. Sandra Price, the COO, did not look at Ashe. She looked at the table, or at the windows, with the expression of a person who has decided not to know certain things and is working hard to maintain that decision. When the ownership transition item came up, Ashe turned to Harriet with his full and practiced warmth. "Miss Voss, the board would love to hear your initial thoughts. I know you've only been with us a few days, and we completely understand that this is all very new, but we're keen to understand your vision." She had been expecting this. Vision was the word people used when they wanted to hear something vague enough to disregard. "I don't have a vision yet," Harriet said. "I'm still learning." Ashe smiled. "Of course, take all the time you need." "I do have a question, though," she said. Certainly. Merville Advisory Partners, she said. Could you tell me more about the work they've been doing for us? The quality of the silence in the room changed. It was not that anyone moved or made a sound. It was that the room's temperature dropped by some unphysical measure, some degree of tension that was invisible but present. Ash's expression did not change. That, she noted, was itself a tell, the expression staying too perfectly in place for a fraction too long. Merville, he said, yes, they're a consultancy we've been using for some strategic advisory work. Barry, perhaps you can. Of course, Barry Good said, with the smoothness of someone who had prepared for this. They've been advising on the restructuring of our continental operations. Excellent work, very well regarded. I couldn't find much about them publicly, Harriet said mildly. Do you have their principal work products? Reports, recommendations, that sort of thing. Certainly, Good said. I'll have them sent to you. Thank you, Harriet said. She asked nothing else. She sat for the remainder of the meeting and watched, and at the end she shook hands and thanked them all and said she looked forward to working with them, and she meant it, though not in the way they thought she meant it. The reports from Merville Advisory Partners arrived on Friday morning. They were, she noted, comprehensive 40 pages each, well-formatted, professionally produced. They were also on close reading, not quite advisory reports. They were summaries. Summaries of analyses with the underlying analyses not attached. The kind of document that looks like evidence of work done while not actually containing the work. She had spent 12 years in an archive that held, among other things, records of corporate governance inquiries from the 1970s and 1980s. She knew what a document produced to satisfy a request looked like, as opposed to a document produced to convey information. She wrote a brief reply to Barry Good thanking him for the reports and asking for the underlying analyses and data sets. His reply came back that afternoon. The underlying materials are proprietary to Merville. We don't hold copies on file. I can request them directly from Merville, though it may take some time. She read the email twice. Then she opened a new window on her laptop and typed the name Thomas Birch into the company's house search function and followed the network of company registrations that his name appeared in, cross-referencing them against the networks she had already built in her notebook. Thomas Birch, director of Merville Advisory Partners, was also a director of a company called Bridwell Capital, registered in the Cayman Islands. Bridwell Capital was a shareholder in a company called Harrenfield Holdings. Harrenfield Holdings had, 12 months ago, submitted a preliminary expression of interest in acquiring certain assets of Voss Meridian Industries. The expression of interest had been filed with Voss Meridian's board and was referenced in the board's subcommittee minutes she had found. Edmund had not been informed. She sat with this for a long time. Then she made a call. The person she called was not a solicitor and not a regulator. She was a woman named Dorothy Fenn, who was 61 years old and had spent 30 years as a forensic accountant specializing in corporate fraud, and who was now semi-retired in the sense that she still took cases she found interesting. Harriet had worked with Dorothy on a previous occasion, a historical archival project that had turned out to involve more recent impropriety than anyone had anticipated. And Dorothy had the quality that Harriet valued above almost all others in professional relationships, which was that she did not waste words. "How quickly can you get to Sheffield?" Harriet asked. "What have you got?" Dorothy said. "Something that started 3 years ago and is probably 3 to 6 months from completion." "What kind of completion?" "The kind where someone else ends up owning a substantial engineering company, and the original owner doesn't know it's happened until it's documented in a way that's very hard to reverse." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "Asset stripping through subsidiary valuation." "Partly. There's also an advisory structure that looks like money going out and might be money going in a circle." "Circular payments." "Possibly." "How much of it have you documented?" "Enough to know where to look, not enough to prove anything yet." "Right," Dorothy said. "I can be there Tuesday." "Come to the company. I'll say you're my personal advisor." "Am I?" "You are now," Harriet said. She spent the weekend at Cartwell House going through the rest of Edmund's files. Mrs. Renton cooked for her without being asked and did not ask questions, and Harriet worked in the study with the quiet efficiency of someone who knows that time is not on their side, but who also knows that panic is the enemy of accuracy. On Sunday evening she found, in a bundle of correspondence from 4 years ago, the year before Ash had joined, a series of letters between Edmund and a man named Robert Calloway, who had been at that time the previous managing director of Voss Meridian. The letters were about a potential acquisition offer. A company, unnamed in the letters, referred to only as the consortium, had approached Edmund about purchasing Voss Meridian. Edmund had declined. The letters were cordial but firm. Edmund was not interested in selling. The company had been his life's work. It would remain in the family. Robert Calloway had left Voss Meridian 6 months after these letters, for reasons the correspondence did not specify. 3 months later, Clifford Ash had been appointed. She read the letters again. Then she went to Edmund's desk and opened the bottom drawer. She had saved it for last, intuition rather than method, and found a single folder that Edmund had labeled in his careful handwriting Cab. Inside the folder was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. Edmund's hand, shaky now, this was recent, she could tell from the character of the writing. Cab equals Clifford Ash plus Bridwell. 3 words and a symbol, an equal sign, and a name she recognized. Edmund had known. He had found it or found enough of it, and he had written it down and put it here, and he had left it for her because he had understood, even at the end, that documents were the only weapons that lasted. She folded the paper and placed it carefully in her own folder. She thought of Edmund in this study, ill and old and angry, not the performative anger of Gerald or Philippa, but the quiet anger of a man who has built something over 30 years and watched it being taken from him piece by piece, and who has not known what to do about it, and who has finally, at the end, chosen the one person he believed could do something. "I understand," she said to the empty room. She said it quietly, not for effect. Just because it was true. On Monday morning, she arrived at Voss Meridian and went directly to the desk of Sandra Price. Sandra Price was the COO, the Chief Operating Officer, and she was the only person on the board who had looked at the table instead of at Clifford Ash when difficult questions were asked. Harriet had thought about this several times over the weekend and had concluded that it was the most significant thing she had observed in the board meeting. Price was 50, sharp-faced, precise in the way that people who have survived corporate environments for a long time become precise, measuring everything, spending energy carefully, watching without appearing to watch. She looked up from her screen when Harriet appeared in her doorway with a slight expression of surprise that became, when she registered who it was, a different kind of expression, cautious, assessing. "Miss Voss," she said. "Mrs. Price, do you have 10 minutes?" A pause, of course. Harriet sat. She did not bring out her notebook. She kept her hands in her lap and she looked at Sandra Price directly and she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you tell me is between us for now. I'm not going to use your name without your consent." Sandra Price looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind her expression, not precisely fear, but the adjacent thing. The thing that happens when a person who has been very careful for a very long time recognizes that they are being offered a door out of a room they have been locked in. "Ask your question," Sandra Price said. "How long have you known that something was wrong?" The silence was long. Sandra Price looked at her desk. Then she looked back at Harriet. "Long enough," she said. "Would you be willing to tell me what you know?" "It would depend," Sandra said carefully, "on what you intend to do with it." "I intend," Harriet said, "to stop it." Another silence, longer. "There's a file," Sandra Price said finally. "I've kept it on a personal drive, not the company system. I didn't know what to do with it." Edmund was ill. Going to the board felt and going outside felt. "I understand," Harriet said. "It's not everything, I don't have everything, but what I have," she stopped, started again. "What I have shows how the contracts with Merville were structured, and it shows who approved them." "Who approved them?" "Barry Good," Sandra said, "with Ash's direction, but there's more." She looked at Harriet with the expression of a person taking a very specific kind of decision. "There are payments that went through Good's approval to an account that isn't on Merville's standard billing details. I flagged it internally 8 months ago. The flag was reviewed and dismissed. I was told it was an administrative processing matter." "And you kept the flag," Harriet said. "I keep everything," Sandra Price said. "I've been keeping everything for 2 years." Harriet looked at her. "Mrs. Price," she said, "would you be available to meet with my financial advisor on Tuesday?" Sandra Price exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way a person exhales when they have been holding something for a very long time. "Yes," she said, "I would." That evening, walking back to her hotel through the Sheffield streets, the November dark coming down early, the city full of its ordinary weekday sounds, Harriet thought about Edmund, about the letter he had written her, about the fact that he had spent the last 18 months of his life knowing he was being stolen from and not being able to stop it, and that he had died having placed everything he had left, the company, the evidence, the fight, in the hands of a 34-year-old woman who worked in an archive in Edinburgh. She thought about Gerald, in the solicitor's office, saying what does she know about running a company. She thought about Clifford Ashe, seeing her walk through the operations floor in her 6-year-old coat and filing her under manageable. She thought about the piece of paper in her folder, with Edmund's handwriting growing shaky at the edges. Cab equals Clifford Ashe plus Bridwell. He had known, he had trusted her to find it, and she had found it. She turned up the collar of her coat against the November wind and walked on. Dorothy Fenn arrived on Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock in a sensible gray car that she parked precisely and without fuss, and she walked into Voss Meridian's lobby with a briefcase and the particular air of a person who has been underestimated so many times in professional settings that the underestimation has become, for them, a form of camouflage. Harriet met her in the lobby and brought her up to the small meeting room with the glass walls. Dorothy looked at the glass walls and then looked at Harriet with an expression that asked a question without words. "I know," Harriet said. "We'll work here today and I'll arrange something better tomorrow." "Who else is coming?" "Sandra Price, COO. She has documentation she hasn't shared with anyone before." Dorothy nodded. She set her briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside, among her own files, was a printed list of names and company registrations that she had apparently prepared independently. "I did some background before I came," she said. "You were right about the circular payments. I found 3 instances in the public accounts that have the right shape. There'll be more in the internal records." "How much total do you think?" "Can't say yet, but the structure," Dorothy looked at her list. "The structure is sophisticated. This isn't someone who improvised. This was designed." "How long ago?" "Based on what's visible publicly, the structure was in place before Ashe joined the company. He was brought in specifically to execute it. Merville was already incorporated." Harriet absorbed this. So the offer to Edmund 4 years ago wasn't the beginning. It might have been an attempt at a cleaner approach. He said no, so they moved to the slower method. "How close are they to completing it?" Dorothy looked at her carefully. "How much have you seen of the IP revaluation?" "Both tranches, the engineering processes." "If those revaluations are legitimate." "They're not." "No, I didn't think so. But if they were on the books, and if the current management were to recommend a restructuring that transferred those assets to a subsidiary." "Which subsidiary?" "One that is, or will be connected to Herrenfield Holdings." Harriet was quiet. "They'd effectively have the core value of the company in a vehicle they control," Dorothy said, "while the shell, the branded company, the contracts, the staff, stays with whoever inherits the shares." "Leaving me with a company that looks intact but isn't." "Leaving you with the name and the liability," Dorothy said. "Yes." The door opened and Sandra Price came in. She had a laptop under her arm and the expression of someone who had not slept particularly well but had made a decision and was going to follow it through. She sat down, looked at Dorothy, and said, "You're the financial person." "Dorothy Fenn," Dorothy said. "You have expertise in fraud investigation." "Among other things." Sandra looked at Harriet. "I need to know that this is going somewhere. I've been sitting on this for 2 years, and I need to know that sharing it doesn't just disappear." "It's going somewhere," Harriet said. "Where?" "I haven't decided the sequence yet," Harriet said honestly. "But I know what it needs to achieve. The restructuring program needs to be stopped before it's completed. The people responsible need to be accountable through the right channels, and the company needs to remain intact." Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her laptop and turned it to face them. "This," she said, "is what I have." They worked for 4 hours. Dorothy asked questions with the systematic precision of someone excavating a site, each question building on the previous answer, widening the understanding without losing the detail. Sandra answered with the kind of precision that comes from 2 years of careful private documentation, of someone who knew they were keeping records for a reason even before they knew what the reason was. By the time they stopped, Harriet had 7 pages of new notes and Dorothy had 3 pages of her own, and the two of them had, between them, a picture of what Clifford Ashe and Barry Good had been constructing for the past 3 years that was, if not complete, at least coherent. The mechanism was layered. Merville Advisory Partners was the visible layer, the payments going out. But Merville was not simply receiving money for work. It was functioning as a conduit, passing funds through a series of accounts into Bridwell Capital, which was the vehicle through which the consortium, still unnamed in the documents but increasingly easy to identify from the pattern of its actions, had been accumulating resources. Those resources had been used to acquire, quietly and through intermediaries, minority positions in a series of companies that held licensing agreements with Voss Meridian. By controlling those minority positions, the consortium could influence the licensing terms. And by influencing the licensing terms, they could, over time, transfer the effective ownership of the engineering processes to vehicles they controlled, without it appearing on Voss Meridian's books as a direct transfer. It was elegant, in the way that a particularly nasty problem is elegant when you finally understand its structure. "Who else is in the consortium?" Dorothy asked. She was looking at Sandra. "I don't know all of them. I know there are at least 3 institutional investors involved, probably funds. The kind where you can't easily trace the beneficial ownership without a court order." "We might need one," Dorothy said. "Is that possible?" Sandra asked. "It's possible," Dorothy said. "It depends on whether there's a regulatory body willing to issue it." "The FCA," Harriet said. Dorothy looked at her. "You've already been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about this for 3 months," Harriet said. "Before Edmund died, he had a letter from a regulatory solicitor, not his main firm, that referenced a preliminary conversation with someone at the FCA. He never followed through. He was too ill." "Do you have the letter?" "Yes." "And the solicitor?" "Still in practice. I'm meeting him tomorrow." Dorothy sat back and looked at her steadily. "You came in here on Monday," she said, "with a lot more than you let on." "I came in with enough to know what questions to ask," Harriet said. "The answers have been what I expected." "What happens when Ashe realizes what you're doing?" Harriet looked at the glass wall of the meeting room, through which she could see the corridor, and in the corridor 2 people walking past who were, she noted this, not quite not looking in her direction. "He probably already suspects something," she said. "I asked about Merville in the board meeting. He's too careful not to have registered that." "So what do you do?" "I do what I've been doing," Harriet said. "I learn more than he thinks I know, and I don't let him see the difference." The solicitor was a man named Alastair Ford, small, precise, with the contained energy of someone who had spent decades operating in spaces where imprecision had consequences. He received her in his office in Leeds, and she laid the regulatory letter in front of him, and he read it without speaking and then looked up at her. "Edmund came to me 8 months before he died," he said. "He was very clear about what he believed was happening. He was less clear about what he wanted done about it." "He didn't want to fight," Harriet said. "He was tired," Ford agreed. "And he was not certain enough of the evidence. The evidence was incomplete." "It's more complete now," Harriet said. She placed her folder on the desk. Not everything, she had learned from years of working with sensitive documents, that you did not show everything at once. You showed what was necessary to establish credibility, and you kept the rest until you understood who you were showing it to. She showed Ford the company's house network she had traced, the connection between Merville, Bridwell, and Herrenfield, the board's subcommittee minutes, Edmund's note. Ford read in silence. When he finished, he put the papers together carefully and set them on the desk and said, "This is not nothing." "No," Harriet agreed. "To go to the FCA, you would need more than this. You would need the financial evidence, the actual flows. My financial advisor is working on it. The company's accounts are internally held, without a court order." "I have internal access," Harriet said. I'm the controlling shareholder. I have access to the document management system. Ford looked at her. You're in the building. I'm in the building. He was quiet for a moment. How much time do you think you have before they realize how close you are? Less than I'd like, Harriet said. Which is why I need to understand what the FCA would need, and I need to understand it precisely so that I can gather it in the right form. Evidence of specific financial flows, Ford said. Documented connection between those flows and the individuals concerned. Evidence of intent, which is the hardest part. I have Edmund's note, Harriet said. Is that evidence of intent? It's evidence of Edmund's understanding, which is circumstantial, he thought for a moment. But you said your advisor has identified circular payments. 3 instances in public accounts. If there are corresponding instances in the internal accounts. There will be. Then that begins to look like a pattern rather than an anomaly. Yes, Harriet said. And if those payments can be traced to accounts connected to Ash or Good personally. Can I compel that disclosure as controlling shareholder? Ford considered this carefully. You have the right to full financial disclosure from the company's executive team. In practice, they can obstruct, but the obstruction itself becomes a document. Harriet thought about that. The obstruction itself becomes a document, yes. What about the IP revaluation? She asked. The engineering processes. If they were fraudulently revalued, if a credentialed independent valuation shows the actual worth significantly exceeds what was recorded, that is very clear. That is the most concrete thing you could bring. I'd need an independent valuation. Can you commission one without their knowledge? I can commission one in my own capacity as the beneficial owner of the controlling share, Harriet said. The share transferred at Edmund's death. The assets it controls are mine to commission assessments of. Ford was quiet for a moment, and then he did something she had not expected. He smiled. Not the practiced smile of someone performing confidence, but the genuine, slightly surprised smile of someone who has just been reminded why they got into the law in the first place. Miss Voss, he said, I think we should talk about retaining me formally. I think so too, Harriet said. She spent the next 2 weeks at Voss Meridian, working in her glass-walled meeting room, speaking to the people she needed to speak to, and being observed doing things that she wanted to be observed doing. This was, she understood, a kind of performance, not a dishonest one, but a managed one. She attended meetings and asked measured questions. She toured the project sites and showed appropriate interest in the technical work. She had lunch once with Clifford Ash, who was warm and comprehensive and managed her with considerable skill, and she allowed herself to be managed, which was the only response that served her. What she did not do, she did not share what she had found. She did not tell anyone outside her small team, Dorothy, Sandra, Alastair, Ford, what the picture looked like. She did not ask the questions she most wanted to ask. She did not, at any point, give Clifford Ash any reason to feel that the timeline needed to be accelerated. Because acceleration would be his most dangerous response. If Ash believed the restructuring was about to be exposed, he would move the remaining steps forward immediately, before the evidence was complete. The asset transfer, the moment when the intellectual property moved from Voss Meridian's books to the subsidiaries connected to Herrenfield Holdings, had not yet happened. It was the final step. It was the step that would need to be undone if it was allowed to occur, and undoing it would be far harder than preventing it. She was buying time by appearing not to need time. It was, she thought, the inverse of everything that people like Gerald expected of a person in her position. They expected urgency, declarations, the overcompensating activity of someone trying to prove they deserved to be where they were. They did not expect patience. They did not expect the quiet of someone who already knew where they were going. On the Thursday of the second week, she found the young man. He was the one she had noticed on her first day on the operations floor, the one who had met her eyes and then looked quickly away. His name was Daniel Croft, and he was 28, and he worked in the contract management division, and she had found in the document management system that he had raised an internal query 7 months ago about the Merville contracts, specifically about the billing structure and the absence of deliverables documentation. The query had been dismissed as an administrative oversight. Daniel Croft had not raised another query after that. She found him at the end of a Thursday afternoon and asked if he had a moment. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been trying to disappear for 7 months and has been found anyway, and he said yes, and she took him to a small meeting room, not the glass one, and closed the door. "Your query from March," she said, "about the Merville contracts." He was very still. "I'm not here to cause you any difficulty," she said, "but I'd like to understand what you saw." He looked at his hands for a moment, then he looked at her. "How do you know about the query?" "I have access to the document management system." "Does anyone else know you've been looking at that?" "No," she said. He was quiet for a long time. She waited. This was something she was good at, because an archive required it, the capacity to wait for a document to yield its meaning in its own time. "The billing structure didn't match any advisory contract I'd seen before," he said finally. "We contract out to a lot of consultancies. You get a feel for how they bill. Merville was different. The invoices didn't reference deliverables like the specific work product each payment was for. They just referenced the contract number and a phase code, and the phase codes weren't in any project system I could find." "Did you ask about the phase codes?" "I asked my line manager. He said they were in a separate system that I didn't have access to, and that was—" He stopped. "That was the end of it," Harriet said. "That was the end of it for me, yes." He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been carrying something uncomfortable. "Should it not have been?" "No," she said, "it should not." "Is something—" He stopped again. "Something is wrong," she said. "I'm addressing it. I wanted you to know that your original instinct was correct." He looked at her steadily. "Can I help?" She considered him. He was young, careful, clearly intelligent, and had been frightened into silence for 7 months. He was also still here, had not left the company, had not made noise outside official channels, had simply stayed and kept quiet and waited, which was either passivity or something else. "Can you document what you saw?" she asked. "Precisely. Dates, invoice references, what you asked and what you were told. Not for submission anywhere yet, just for your own records." "I already have," he said. She looked at him. "When did you start?" "The same day I raised the query," he said. "I thought I wasn't sure who I could trust, so I wrote it down." She thought of Edmund. "Your father used to say that you were born with a talent for seeing what was missing." "Keep it somewhere secure," she said. "Not on the company system." "It's on a personal device," he said. "Has been since March." "Good," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Croft." "Daniel," he said. "Daniel," she agreed. The call from Gerald came on a Friday afternoon, which she had half expected. "I wanted to reach out," Gerald said, in the tone of someone who had rehearsed the tone. "Just to check in, see how you're finding things." "Fine, thank you," Harriet said. "Because I've been speaking to a few people, friends, you know, people with some experience in industry, and there's a real concern that that this might be more than you bargained for." "I appreciate the concern," Harriet said. "And the thing is, and I say this as family, the board members I've spoken to, Clifford Ash, for instance, they're very capable people, very experienced. I just want to make sure that you feel supported." She noted the board members I've spoken to. She noted Clifford Ash, for instance. "How do you know Clifford Ash?" she asked. A very brief pause. We were introduced recently." "Through mutual connections." "Recently meaning after the will was read." Yes, we were introduced after. He reached out, actually, which was very kind of him." "Gerald," she said, "thank you for calling. I'll be in touch if I need anything." She ended the call and sat for a moment with her phone in her hand. Ash had reached out to Gerald within 2 weeks of the will being read. That was faster than she had expected. It told her something about his assessment of the timeline. He was looking for an alternative route. Gerald, who had the right temperament and the wrong information and the right surname, was the obvious candidate. What could Gerald do? He could contest the will, as Whitmore had said. A contest, even if unsuccessful, would create time and uncertainty, exactly what Ash needed. Or Gerald could be convinced to put pressure on Harriet in some other way. Or, more concerning, Gerald could be positioned as an alternative candidate for control if Harriet could be managed out. She called Alistair Ford. "How solid is the will?" she asked when he picked up. "Very," he said. "Why?" "Ash has made contact with my cousin. the one who would benefit most from the will being contested. Silence, how do you know? Gerald just called me. He was subtle but not quite subtle enough. That's concerning. It tells me Ash is not comfortable with the pace, she said. He's looking for alternatives. Which means he's worried. Which means something has made him worried, she thought about this. The IP valuation, she said. We commissioned it 2 weeks ago. The valuer was independent and discreet, Ford said. Discreet, yes, but not invisible. If someone at the company noticed an independent valuer making inquiries. The inquiries were conducted through official channels that wouldn't normally flag internally, Ford said, but he sounded less certain. I'll ask Dorothy if anything unusual came through in the financial records in the last 2 weeks, Harriet said. If there's been any movement in the subsidiary structures. A defensive reorganization. If he's trying to accelerate the transfer. When can Dorothy give you a full picture? End of next week at the earliest. Can you accelerate? She thought about Dorothy Fenn, who was systematic and exact, and who did not accelerate without losing accuracy. I'll ask her, Harriet said, but I won't push her beyond what's reliable. The evidence has to be clean. Agreed. What about the employee, Croft? He has documentation going back 7 months. It corroborates what Sandra has from her end. That's 2 internal witnesses, Ford said. Yes. That changes the shape of a regulatory submission. I know, she said. Dorothy called on Monday with something in her voice that was not quite urgency, but was its close neighbor. I need you to look at something, she said. What? A filing. It came through company's house this morning. I set up an alert for anything connected to the entities we've been tracking. What kind of filing? Herrenfield Holdings has filed an amended Articles of Association. Harriet was very still. When was it filed? Friday, end of day Friday. The day Gerald had called, the day after. What does the amendment do? It creates a new class of shares, Dorothy said. A class that, if issued, would give the holder voting control over Herrenfield without owning the majority of the equity. They're preparing the final move, Harriet said. Yes, and I found something else. The subsidiary I've been watching, the one that holds the licensing positions connected to the IP assets. Go on. There was a board resolution filed, internal to Voss Meridian, not public. It was in the document system, but it was filed under an administrative category that isn't part of the normal review track. Who filed it? Barry Good's name is on the resolution. It's dated last Thursday. Thursday, the day before Gerald's call, the day before Herrenfield's filing. What does the resolution authorize? A transfer of the licensing agreements, Dorothy said, subject to approval which, she paused. The approval threshold is one that can be met by the current board without the controlling shareholders' consent, under a specific clause in the Articles of Association. Harriet closed her eyes for 1 second. Can they do that? She said. Legally, the clause exists. Edmund's original articles included it for operational efficiency. It was designed for routine licensing decisions, not for this. No, but technically if they invoke it. Can it be challenged? Yes, but to challenge it effectively you'd need to demonstrate that the clause was invoked in bad faith, that the decision was not in fact routine, but was designed to transfer value to connected parties, which requires the evidence we already have, Harriet said, plus the financial analysis, plus the independent valuation, which isn't complete yet. How much longer? 5 days, maybe 4 if I work through the weekend. Work through the weekend, Harriet said. I'll pay double. I don't need double, Dorothy said. I need you to get me the internal financial records for the last 18 months, full access, not the summary files. I'll get them today. Harriet, Dorothy's voice was very level. If they invoke that clause before we have the evidence in submittable form. They won't, Harriet said. How confident are you? She thought about it honestly. 60%, she said. I need to buy 4 more days. How? By giving them something to argue about, she said. She sent a letter through Alastair Ford's office to the Voss Meridian board, formally, as the controlling shareholder, requesting a special general meeting to discuss the company's strategic direction, and specifically, the current status of the advisory contracts that had been commissioned in the previous 18 months. A formal request for a special general meeting under the Articles of Association required the board to respond within 5 business days. Scheduling the meeting required an additional notice period of 14 days. It wouldn't stop them from invoking the licensing transfer clause, but it would put them on notice that she was watching the governance process formally, which created risk for them. Any action taken while a formal SGM request was outstanding, and that could be seen as prejudicing the shareholders' interests, would add a further layer to the challenge. More importantly, it would show Ash that she was fighting in the governance arena, which was the arena he expected and understood, the arena where he had the advantage of institutional knowledge and established relationships. If he was watching that space, he might not be watching the others. She sent the letter on Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Clifford Ash had called her directly, not through Marcus Webb, directly on her mobile number, which she noted. "Harriet," he said, with the warmth of a man who has just noticed that someone has entered the room in a direction he didn't expect. "I've received the formal notice. I wanted to reach out personally." "Of course," she said. "I want to make sure you're getting the information you need. I think there may have been some gaps in our communication. I'd love to sit down, perhaps tomorrow, have a proper conversation about where the company is and where it's going." "I'd like that," she said. "Thursday would work better for me." A pause. "Thursday, of course, whatever works for you." She was moving the meeting 2 days further out. "And I'll ask Bari to put together a full briefing on the advisory contracts," she said pleasantly, "since that seems to be the area you're most interested in addressing." "Of course," he said. "Bari will be glad to." "Wonderful," she said. "I'll see you Thursday." She ended the call and looked at the wall of her hotel room. 4 days, maybe 3. Dorothy delivered the analysis on Sunday evening, at 11 o'clock, in a form that was precise, cross-referenced, and would be, as Dorothy put it, interpretable by any forensic auditor or regulator with basic competence. The circular payments were not 3 instances, they were 11. Totaling, across the full 18-month period, approximately £8.7 million that had moved from Voss Meridian through Merville Advisory Partners, through a chain of accounts, and eventually into Bridwell Capital, which was a vehicle that, as Dorothy had traced with considerable patience through international company registries, was ultimately controlled by 2 beneficial owners, one of whom was a member of the consortium that had made the original acquisition offer to Edmund 4 years ago, and the other of whom was Clifford Ash. Clifford Ash personally, not a company connected to him, not a family member, him. "This is it," Harriet said. "This is it," Dorothy agreed. "He's been paying himself through the advisory structure. The advisory work is partially real, some of the reports exist, but the payments significantly exceed any reasonable valuation of the work, and the excess flows directly to his personal vehicle. Combined with the IP revaluation. The independent valuation came through this afternoon," Dorothy said. "The engineering processes are valued at £4.1 million. They were booked at £1.7 million on the last internal valuation." "A difference of £2.4 million, Harriet said. "Which, if the licensing transfer had gone through, would have transferred to a vehicle that Ash and his consortium control." "At a deliberately suppressed price," Harriet said. "At a deliberately suppressed price," Dorothy confirmed. Harriet sat very still for a moment. "The board resolution," she said, "for the licensing transfer, has it been invoked?" "Not as of the last check on the document system," Dorothy said, "but I can't monitor it in real time." "The meeting with Ash is Thursday morning," Harriet said. "They're unlikely to invoke it before that. It would look too clearly reactive." "That's my read too," Dorothy said. "But I wouldn't count on Thursday morning. I'd move if I could." "Wednesday," Harriet said. "I'll move the meeting to Wednesday." "And then I meet with Alastair Ford first thing tomorrow, and we assemble the submission. And Wednesday morning, I go into that meeting." "And—" Harriet was quiet for a moment. "And I let them keep thinking," she said, "that I don't know." The meeting on Wednesday morning was held, at Ash's suggestion, in the fourth-floor boardroom, the same room as the first board meeting, with the long table and the car park view and the floor-to-ceiling windows that admitted a flat gray November light. Ash was already there when Harriet arrived. Barry Good was there. Marcus Webb was there. And unexpectedly, two people she had not been told would attend. A man introduced to her as Robert Clement, a partner at a large city law firm, and a woman introduced as Diana Forsyth, described as an independent financial consultant. She noted their presence without showing that she had noted it. They had brought their own lawyers and their own financial cover. This was not a meeting to brief her. This was a meeting to manage her. "Thank you for moving the date," Ash said as she sat. "I know it was short notice." "Not at all," Harriet said. The briefing began. It was thorough, professional, and managed with considerable skill. Barry Good presented the financial picture, revenues, margins, forward pipeline. Robert Clement explained the governance structure in a tone that was informative and subtly intimidating, full of terms and frameworks that were designed to convey complexity. Diana Forsyth discussed the advisory contracts with a prepared smoothness that covered the essential meaning of what was being said, which was, "Everything is in order, there is nothing unusual, please be reassured." Harriet listened. She asked occasional questions, small questions, questions about process and logistics, the questions of someone trying to understand the landscape. She allowed her notebook to be visible on the table, though she did not write anything in it during the meeting, which she had found, in her years of archival work, had a particular effect on people who were watching to see what you were recording. When the prepared material was exhausted, Clifford Ash leaned back in his chair with the relaxed authority of a man who has just demonstrated competence to someone he needed to demonstrate it to. "I hope that gives you a clearer picture," he said. "I want to be absolutely transparent. Edmund trusted me with this company, and I intend to honor that trust." "I appreciate that," Harriet said. "And in terms of the SGM you've requested, I completely understand the instinct. It's the right thing to do, to review the strategic direction. But I want to make sure that any decisions are taken with the full benefit of the board's expertise and our advisors' input." "Of course," she said. "Because there are some decisions that need to be made in the near term about the company's structure, and I want to make sure you're supported through those." "What kind of decisions?" she said, mildly, curiously. He paused almost imperceptibly. "Structural decisions, about how the company holds certain assets, how the licensing arrangements are managed going forward. There are some efficiency opportunities that the team has been exploring." "The licensing arrangements for the engineering processes," she said. Another pause, fractionally longer. "Among other things," he said. "I'd be interested to understand those," she said. "Could you walk me through the current structure?" What followed was a masterpiece of not quite explaining something. Ash gestured to Good, who gave a brief and selective account of the licensing structure that was accurate in its components and deeply misleading in its omissions. Robert Clement added a legal framing that was technically sound. Diana Forsyth provided numbers that were correct but not complete. Harriet listened to all of it and asked 3 specific, factual questions that each received a vague but professionally packaged answer. Then she looked at the table for a moment, in the way she had learned to look at a document when she was about to say something that required the full attention of everyone in the room. "I want to share something," she said. The room's attention was immediate and total. 4 people who had been managing a meeting, suddenly recognizing that the meeting had changed. "I've been doing some reading," she said. "Background work, trying to understand the company as Edmund would have understood it." "Of course," Ash said. The warmth was very steady. "I came across a reference to the original offer, the acquisition offer from 4 years ago. The consortium that approached Edmund," she looked at Ash. "Do you know the one I mean?" A very precise stillness came over him. It was different from the managed stillness of someone who was listening professionally. It was the stillness of a person who has just recognized that something they thought was contained is not. "There was an approach," he said. "Yes, Edmund chose not to pursue it." "Do you know who made the approach?" "A consortium, several institutional investors. I don't have the full detail." "I do," Harriet said. She placed a single sheet on the table. It was a copy of a corporate registration document. Harrenfield Holdings, with its beneficial owners listed, one of which was Bridwell Capital. Harrenfield Holdings made that approach, she said. And the beneficial owners of Harrenfield include a vehicle called Bridwell Capital. She looked at him steadily. You're a beneficial owner of Bridwell Capital, Mr. Ashe. No one in the room moved. The only sound was the distant, impersonal hum of the building. Clifford Ashe looked at the document. Robert Clement leaned forward. Barry Good looked at the table. That's a complex set of entities, Ashe said. His voice was very controlled. You'd need to understand the full structure before drawing. I've traced the full structure, Harriet said, with help. She placed the second document on the table. Dorothy's analysis, the first page only, which contained a clear summary of the circular payment flows, the entities involved, and the total figure. £8.7 million. This is a preliminary summary of payments made to Merville Advisory Partners over 18 months, she said. Traced through the chain of accounts, they terminate ultimately in Bridwell Capital. Another piece of paper. This is an independent valuation of the engineering process assets, commissioned through my solicitor in my capacity as controlling shareholder. Another. This is the internal board resolution, filed under an administrative category, authorizing the transfer of licensing agreements, which, at the internally recorded valuation, would have transferred approximately £2.4 million of understated value to vehicles connected to Harrenfield Holdings. She placed the last sheet, Daniel Croft's documented query from 7 months ago, with his name removed at her request but the substance intact. And this is an internal document flagging anomalies in the Merville billing structure, which was raised through official channels, reviewed and dismissed. The room was very quiet. Robert Clement said carefully, Miss Voss, these are serious allegations and they would need to be. They're not allegations, Harriet said pleasantly. They're documents. The allegations, if there are to be any, will be made by the Financial Conduct Authority. Good's head came up. The FCA, she said, will receive a formal submission this afternoon, prepared by my financial advisor and my solicitor, including all of the documentation I've mentioned and a full forensic analysis. My solicitor has also filed a restraining notice with the court regarding the pending licensing transfer, which prevents the resolution from being invoked pending investigation. Ashe's face had done something during this, not collapsed, because he was too controlled for collapse, but settled into a different configuration, one that was no longer managing anything but simply existing with the weight of what was in front of it. I think, he said quietly, that we should. I'd like everyone except Sandra Price to leave the room, Harriet said. Sandra isn't, Ashe started. Sandra has been copied on this correspondence, Harriet said. She's a witness to the internal process. I'd like the others to leave. Robert Clement stood first, with the careful professional manner of someone who is calculating the position they are in and not enjoying the calculation. Diana Forsyth followed. Barry Good stood with the quality of movement of a man who has aged significantly in a short period. Marcus Webb, who had said nothing for 2 hours, followed them out. Clifford Ashe remained. He looked at Harriet across the table, across all the papers she had placed there, the small archaeology of what she had found, and for a moment she saw something that was not managed at all. Something that was, perhaps, the first honest expression she had seen from him, which was that he had simply not believed this was possible. He had looked at her on the first day, the coat, the job, the quiet, and he had made a calculation that had turned out to be catastrophically wrong. You've been doing this for a while, he said. Yes, she said. Before Edmund died. Yes. He was quiet, he knew. He suspected. He gave me what he'd found and he asked me to look. And the SGM request, the Thursday meeting, that was. Time, she said simply. He looked at the table. Then he looked at her with an expression that was, stripped of everything else, a kind of recognition. What happens now? The FCA investigation will proceed, she said. My solicitor has also engaged the Serious Fraud Office, given the scale. The restraining notice prevents the licensing transfer. The board resolution is void. She paused. What happens to you depends on the investigations. That's no longer in my hands. And the company. She looked at him. He had asked, she thought, with something like genuine interest, not in the survival of what he had been building, but in the survival of what Edmund had built, the thing that had been there before him, which was, perhaps, an odd thing to ask, given everything. But she answered it honestly. "The company will be fine," she said. "That's the point." The SGM, the Special General Meeting, took place 3 weeks later. By that time, the FCA had confirmed receipt of the submission and had issued its own restraining notices. Good had resigned. Ash had engaged his own legal team and was no longer attending the office. The board had reconstituted itself around Sandra Price, who had agreed to serve as interim managing director pending a formal appointment process. The meeting itself was well attended. The institutional investors who held minority positions were there. The independent non-executives were there. There were representatives from the press, because somewhere in the preceding weeks the story had become known to people who covered regulatory matters, and a company with a credible fraud investigation underway was the kind of story that covered itself. Gerald was not there. Gerald had called once after the news became public, a brief, painful call in which he had tried to express both support and the claim that he had not known about his interactions with Ash, and Harriet had been neither unkind nor particularly generous about this, because she wasn't sure it was true and she wasn't sure it wasn't. Harriet stood at the head of the long table and looked around the room at the people who had, 3 weeks ago, looked back at her from this same room with the collective assessment that she was manageable. She did not give a long speech. She was not a person who gave long speeches. She laid out in clear and precise terms what had been found, what was being addressed, what the company's actual financial position was, which was, once the fraudulent revaluations were corrected, significantly stronger than the internal documentation had suggested, and what she proposed going forward. She proposed keeping Sandra Price as interim MD. She proposed a full governance audit. She proposed a review of all advisory contracts. She proposed the commissioning of an independent assessment of the company's operational future. And she said one other thing, which she had not prepared but which came to her naturally in the room. Looking at the brushed aluminum letters above the building's entrance visible through the window, Voss Meridian, Edmund's name made permanent in metal. Edmund Voss built this company over 30 years. He built it carefully and he built it honestly, and towards the end of his life he saw it being taken from him piece by piece, and he wasn't able to stop it alone. He did the only thing he could think of. He left the controlling share to someone he believed could see what was happening and do something about it. I don't know if I was the right choice. But I intend to make it the right choice. The room was quiet. Sandra Price, at the far end of the table, was looking at her with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a very long time to be in a room where someone was telling the truth. The FCA investigation ran for 8 months. Ash was charged with fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Barry Good, in exchange for cooperation with investigators, entered into a settlement agreement. The consortium connected to Heronfield Holdings, eventually identified as a group of 3 private equity funds operating through intermediaries, was subject to a separate regulatory action. The licensing transfer was unwound. The engineering process assets were revalued at their correct figures. The £8.7 million in circular payments became the centerpiece of the fraud case, which was, in the end, relatively straightforward in its mechanics if complex in its structure. The kind of case that was unremarkable except for the fact that it had very nearly been completed before anyone noticed. Almost anyone. Daniel Croft was promoted. He found out about this through an official email and then came to find Harriet in the large corner office she had eventually and reluctantly moved into and said, slightly awkwardly, "I wanted to say thank you, for you know." "You kept records," she said. "I didn't give you that, you already had it." He looked slightly uncomfortable with the acknowledgement. "Are you staying on?" he asked. "As I mean, are you staying?" She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it since November in the Derbyshire Hills, reading Edmund's papers on the floor of his study. She had a life in Edinburgh. She had her archive, her flat above the cobbled street, her 2 rooms of organized silence. She was not an industrialist. She was not a managing director. She was a person who understood documents and the stories they told, and who was very good at finding the things that weren't there. But Voss Meridian needed someone who understood what Edmund had built, and who cared whether it survived. And Sandra Price, who would likely be confirmed as permanent MD, needed a board chair who would not manage her the way Harriet had been managed. "For now," she said. Daniel Croft nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. She visited Cartwell House one more time that summer, the summer after the winter in which all of this had happened. And it was different in the warm season, the Derbyshire hills green and almost excessive in their greenness, the unhappy house looking slightly less unhappy with the sun on it. She went to Edmund's study and sat in the reading chair. Not on the floor this time, there were no documents to surround herself with, and she thought about Edmund and about her father, and about the particular inheritance of attention that seemed to move through the family, the capacity to notice what was missing. Mrs. Renton brought tea and sat with her for a while, which she hadn't done before, and they talked about Edmund in the way that was possible now that the grief had some distance in it, the small particular details that didn't belong in obituaries or memorial notices, the way he had been unable to watch the news without commenting on every item, his habit of writing the same note twice in case he lost the first one. The way he had said Harriet's name on the phone when he'd called her 18 months ago, carefully, as if testing whether she was real. "He was proud of you," Mrs. Renton said, which was the sentence Harriet had not known she was waiting to hear. "He didn't know what I'd find," Harriet said. "No, but he knew you'd find something." Mrs. Renton looked at her steadily. "He used to say that the quiet ones saw everything. He said you'd been watching since you were small." Harriet looked at the cabinet, locked again now, the documents she had found safely transferred to her own files, to Dorothy's analysis, to the FCA's case file. "I should have visited more," she said. "You visited when he asked," Mrs. Renton said. "That was what mattered." Outside, the Derbyshire hills were doing what they did in summer, which was the same as what they did in winter except with more light. The world's indifference was constant. The world's beauty was constant. The world's tendency to underestimate the people it needed most was, in Harriet's experience, also constant. But documents lasted, evidence lasted, and the work of a person who paid attention lasted longest of all, in the records, in the outcomes, in the companies that were still standing when they might not have been, in the names still written in brushed aluminum above the doors of things that had been built carefully and honestly, and deserved to remain. Gerald eventually apologized, in the form of a letter, about 8 months after everything. It was a careful letter that hedged its admissions with enough conditional phrasing to retain plausible deniability, but there was something in it that she thought might be genuine, a recognition that he had misjudged not just the situation but the person. She wrote back, briefly. She said she hoped they would be in better contact going forward. She meant it in the measured way she meant most things, not as a declaration but as an intention, something to be tested by time rather than promised. She sent the letter on a Monday morning from her desk at Voss Meridian, where she had arrived on time, which she always did now, having given up the affectation of slight lateness once she no longer needed it to manage anyone's expectations. She had a meeting at 10. She had documents to review before it. She had a company that was, by every measure, in better shape than it had been a year ago, revenues up, governance clean, contracts renewed on honest terms, the engineering process assets back on the books at their actual value. She thought about Edmund's letter. "I am trusting you to put the pieces together." She had, not through luck, not through power, not through anything that Gerald or Clifford Ashe or anyone else in that waiting room would have looked at her and imagined. Through attention, through patience, through the quiet discipline of a person who understood that the truth was always somewhere in the documents if you knew how to look. She picked up her pen and opened the first file,